If that shrew gets a single dollar from my father's estate, I'll drag this family through court for years, my son shouted across the lawyer's office while every relative sat frozen in silence around the polished walnut table. No one moved. No one even looked at me at first. They looked at Daniel, at the anger twisting his face, at the veins standing out along his neck. Then, slowly, the room turned toward me as if they expected me to break apart right there beside the tray of untouched coffee cups and legal folders. I didn't. I simply folded my hands in my lap and lowered my eyes to the gold wedding band I still wore, even though Arthur had been buried only 4 days earlier. The office smelled faintly of leather, old paper, and rain drifting in from downtown Boston. Outside the tall windows, November clouds hung low over the city skyline, turning the afternoon gray and cold. Evelyn Brooks, our family attorney for nearly 30 years, removed her glasses carefully and placed them on the table with deliberate calm. "Daniel," she said quietly, "this is a legal proceeding, not a spectacle." But my son only laughed under his breath. "A legal proceeding?" he repeated. "You mean another performance where everyone pretends she actually built any of this?" Beside him, Vanessa shifted in her cream-colored coat and touched his arm lightly, though I could not tell whether she was trying to calm him or encourage him. Her diamond bracelet caught the soft office light every time she moved. "Daniel," she whispered gently, "not here." But there was no real concern in her voice. Only calculation. I had learned to hear the difference years ago. I stared down at Arthur's initials embossed on the corner of the leather folder in front of me and tried not to think about the last morning I saw him alive. The way he stood in our kitchen holding his coffee mug. The way he smiled when he told me the maple trees would probably lose the rest of their leaves before Thanksgiving. 46 years of marriage reduced to a mahogany urn and a room full of people waiting to divide his life into percentages. My father worked himself into the grave for this family. Daniel continued, his voice sharper now. "And I'm not going to sit here while she walks away with half of everything." Half. As if I were some stranger suing the estate instead of the woman who had built that life beside Arthur room by room, paycheck by paycheck, year after year. I noticed my sister-in-law Patricia staring at the tablecloth to avoid meeting my eyes. Across from her, Daniel's cousin shifted uncomfortably in his chair. No one defended me. The silence felt heavier than the rain tapping softly against the windows. Then Evelyn reached for a second folder resting beneath the others. Unlike the first, this one was sealed with Arthur's signature written neatly across the flap. Her expression changed slightly when her fingers touched it. Not sympathy. Something quieter. Something almost cautious. "Before we continue with the formal reading," she said slowly, "there is something Arthur specifically instructed me to play for the family if Margaret was ever publicly humiliated during these proceedings." The room went completely still. Even Daniel stopped breathing for a moment. Then Evelyn looked directly at me for the first time that afternoon and said softly, "Margaret, your husband anticipated this." Nobody spoke after Evelyn said those words. Even the sound of rain against the windows seemed to disappear for a moment. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair, his jaw tight, while Vanessa crossed her arms and stared at the sealed folder in Evelyn's hands as though she already hated whatever was inside it. I kept my eyes lowered because I knew if I looked directly at my son then, I might finally see the stranger he had become. Evelyn slid a small digital recorder across the table, but did not press play yet. "Arthur gave me very clear instructions," she said calmly. "The recording will remain sealed until the appropriate moment." Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "My father was sick during his last months." He was confused. "Your father was perfectly lucid," Evelyn replied without raising her voice. That silence returned again. Heavy, sharp, uncomfortable. I could feel it pressing against my chest. 20 years earlier, Daniel used to sit beside Arthur at our kitchen counter building model sailboats together on Sunday afternoons. He used to call me every Friday just to ask if I needed groceries before a snowstorm. Somewhere between law school, expensive dinner parties, and Vanessa Whitmore's polished smile, that version of my son disappeared quietly, piece by piece, until even his voice sounded unfamiliar to me. Evelyn finally closed the folder and announced that the remainder of the will reading would continue the following morning. Nobody argued. The family gathered their coats carefully, avoiding eye contact like nervous strangers trapped in an elevator. Vanessa was the first to stand. Her heels clicked softly across the hardwood floor as she approached me with that same practiced expression she wore at charity galas and country club dinners. Concern wrapped in perfection. "Margaret," she said gently, resting manicured fingers against my shoulder, "Daniel is grieving. You know how emotional he gets." I looked at her hand for a moment before meeting her eyes. "Your husband called me a shrew in front of my husband's ashes," I said quietly. "That was not grief." Her smile faded only slightly. "You always misunderstand him." Then she walked away without another word. Daniel did not say goodbye to me at all. He shoved his hands into his coat pockets and followed her toward the elevator, while his cousin Matthew gave me a quick apologetic glance before lowering his head. I remained seated long after the room emptied. The coffee beside me had gone cold hours earlier. Outside, downtown Boston blurred beneath the steady November rain. Evelyn sat across from me silently, organizing papers into neat stacks. Finally, she looked up and sighed. "Arthur knew tensions were getting worse," she said softly. "But I do not think even he expected today." I stared at the empty chair where my son had been sitting. "I used to think losing my husband would be the hardest thing I would ever survive," I whispered. I was wrong. Evelyn hesitated before sliding a small brass key across the table toward me. It was old, slightly worn around the edges, attached to a faded leather tag with Arthur's handwriting pressed into the surface. My breath caught the moment I recognized it. "What is this?" I asked quietly, though part of me already knew. "Your husband instructed me to give you that key only if you felt unsafe or unwanted after his death," Evelyn replied. "Margaret, there is something inside the lake house that Arthur did not trust anyone else to find." The rain had not stopped by the time I reached the lake house that evening. Arthur bought the property nearly 25 years earlier, back when Daniel was still in high school, and spent summers fishing from the old cedar dock behind the house. The road leading there curved through dark pine trees coated in mist, and for the first time in days, the silence around me felt calmer than the silence inside our family home. I parked beneath the covered carport and sat in the car for a moment with the engine running, staring at the brass key resting in my palm. Arthur always carried spare keys in strange places. Kitchen drawers, coat pockets, toolboxes nobody opened. But this one felt different. Intentional. Like something he planned long before he became sick. The front porch creaked softly beneath my shoes as I stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of cedar wood, fireplace smoke, and old books. Everything looked exactly as we left it in early October. The wool blanket folded neatly over the sofa. Arthur's reading glasses still resting beside the lamp near his favorite armchair. A half-finished crossword puzzle waiting on the coffee table, as though he might walk back into the room at any moment complaining about the Patriots' defense or asking whether we still had any coffee left. Grief worked strangely like that. Some days it arrived like a storm. Other days it appeared quietly through ordinary objects. I locked the front door behind me and walked toward Arthur's study at the end of the hallway. The key Evelyn gave me fit perfectly into the bottom drawer of his old oak desk. My hands trembled slightly as the lock clicked open. Inside sat a sealed envelope with my name written carefully across the front in Arthur's handwriting. Beneath it was a black folder thick with financial documents, property records, and copies of wire transfers I did not recognize. I sat down, slowly in Arthur's chair, and opened the letter first. "Margaret, if you are reading this, then things unfolded exactly the way I feared they would." I stopped breathing for a moment after reading those words. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the windows while the old grandfather clock near the staircase echoed softly through the empty house. Arthur's handwriting remained steady across every line. He wrote about Daniel's growing debts, about the investment failures he tried to hide over the last 3 years, about Vanessa pressuring him constantly to gain access to family accounts. Arthur admitted he confronted Daniel privately months before his diagnosis became terminal. According to the letter, my son promised to change. He promised to stop treating the family like a business transaction. But Arthur did not believe him anymore. My eyes drifted toward the black folder. Inside were copies of loans Daniel secretly took against company assets. Credit card statements with balances large enough to make my stomach tighten. Emails between Vanessa and a real estate broker discussing the sale of our family estate before Arthur was even buried. One sentence in particular stayed with me. "Once Margaret signs the transfer papers, we can renovate and list the property by spring." I stared at the words for a very long time. Not because I was shocked anymore, but because something inside me finally became still. The confusion was disappearing. Piece by piece, the truth was replacing it. Then I noticed another envelope hidden beneath the folder. Smaller, unmarked. Inside was a second key and a handwritten note from Arthur containing only one sentence. Do not let them know about the upstairs closet until Evelyn arrives. I barely slept that night. The lake house groaned softly under the November wind while branches scraped against the windows like distant whispers. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up pretending to rest and wrapped myself in Arthur's old cable-knit cardigan before walking downstairs to the kitchen. The coffee maker hissed quietly in the dark while I stood at the counter staring out toward the black water beyond the dock. Arthur loved this house because it was the only place where nobody expected anything from him. No investors, no board meetings, no family obligations, just silence and pine trees and cold morning air rolling across the lake. I finally understood why he trusted this place more than people. The second key rested beside my coffee cup, while dawn slowly brightened the horizon in pale shades of gray and blue. I waited until sunrise before climbing the narrow staircase leading to the upper floor hallway. The closet sat at the very end beside the guest bedroom Daniel used during summers when he was younger. I remembered helping him hang baseball jerseys on that same closet door decades earlier, while Arthur grilled hamburgers outside, and the radio played old Bruce Springsteen songs through the open windows. Back then, my son still laughed easily. Back then, home still felt simple. The second key unlocked the closet immediately. Inside, behind winter blankets and storage boxes, sat a small steel safe built into the wall. My pulse slowed the moment I saw it because I already knew Arthur had been planning far beyond the funeral, far beyond the will. Inside the safe were several neatly labeled folders, a flash drive, and another handwritten letter. This one was shorter than the first. Margaret, if Daniel has already shown you who he has become, then you must stop protecting him from the consequences of it. I closed my eyes for a moment after reading those words. Mothers spend their entire lives trying to soften the world for their children. Even when those children become grown strangers wearing $1,000 coats and cold expressions. Especially then. The folders contained copies of private communications between Daniel and Vanessa discussing company shares, property transfers, and contingency plans if I refused to cooperate after Arthur's death. Some of the messages sounded less like family conversations and more like business negotiations. One email from Vanessa chilled me completely. Arthur is weak now. Once Margaret is isolated, Daniel will finally have control over everything. I read that sentence 3 times before setting the papers down carefully beside me. Not because I was emotional anymore. Because I was realizing how long this had been happening beneath my own roof, while I continued setting holiday tables and mailing birthday cards and pretending distance was not the same thing as cruelty. Then I noticed the flash drive labeled only with a date from 8 months earlier. I carried my coffee into Arthur's study and inserted it into his old laptop. The screen flickered softly before a video file appeared. Arthur sat alone at his office desk wearing the navy sweater I bought him one Christmas years ago. He looked tired, thinner than I remembered, but his eyes were steady. If you are watching this, Margaret, he began quietly. Then Daniel made the exact choice I prayed he would not make. My chest tightened as I leaned closer to the screen. Arthur sighed softly before continuing. There is one final document Evelyn does not know exists yet. And if our son crossed the line, I believe he already crossed. You must be the one who decides whether he deserves to see it. I watched Arthur's video 3 times before the sun fully rose over the lake. Each time, I noticed something different. The way his hands trembled slightly when he reached for his coffee mug. The exhaustion behind his eyes. The sadness in his voice whenever he mentioned Daniel. It was not anger. That was what hurt the most. Arthur sounded heartbroken. By late morning, the rain finally stopped. Thin streaks of pale sunlight spread across the water while cold wind carried fallen leaves across the dock outside. I remained inside the study sorting through the folders carefully, page by page, until my phone vibrated against the desk. Daniel. For a moment, I simply stared at his name on the screen. Then I answered. Where are you? He asked immediately. No hello. No concern. Just irritation. At the lake house. I replied calmly. Silence followed for half a second. You should not be there alone. I almost smiled at that. Not because the comment sounded caring. Because it sounded nervous. I needed time away from the city, I said quietly. The funeral was exhausting. I heard muffled voices in the background before Vanessa's voice drifted faintly through the phone. Ask her if she found the documents. My fingers tightened slightly around the receiver. Daniel lowered his voice. Mother, Evelyn is continuing the will reading tomorrow morning. We need to settle a few things beforehand. There it was. Business. Always business now. What things? I asked. The estate paperwork. Property ownership. Tax transfers. Vanessa already contacted an accountant. I looked toward Arthur's folders spread across the desk beside me. That was fast, I said softly. Daniel sighed heavily, the same way Arthur used to when frustrated after long meetings. Mother, please do not make this harder than it needs to be. Harder. The word echoed strangely in my mind after everything I had discovered. I glanced through the study window toward the dock where Daniel once spent entire summers trying to catch trout with his father. Arthur used to cheer every time he caught even the smallest fish. He used to call Daniel his greatest accomplishment. I will be back tonight, I finally told him. Good, he replied quickly. Too quickly. We should all have dinner together before tomorrow. Dinner together. As though he had not humiliated me in front of half our family less than 24 hours earlier. When I returned to the main house that evening, every light inside was glowing warmly against the dark autumn sky. From outside, it looked peaceful, elegant, like one of those perfect homes featured in holiday magazines beside headlines about family traditions and timeless memories. Inside felt different. Vanessa stood in the kitchen arranging wine glasses beside a marble countertop while soft jazz played through hidden speakers. She wore cream cashmere and pearl earrings, perfectly composed as always. Margaret, she said smoothly when I entered. We were beginning to worry. I handed my coat to the housekeeper and looked around slowly. Where is Daniel? In your husband's office, she answered before correcting herself almost instantly. Arthur's office. My husband's office. Not Daniel's. Not hers. Mine included in every memory built inside those walls. I walked toward the hallway quietly and stopped just before the office door. Inside, Daniel was speaking with someone on speakerphone. Once. The transfer is complete, he said in a low voice. The property can be listed immediately after the holidays. I stood perfectly still outside the door while my son discussed selling the home where I had spent nearly half my life. Then another voice crackled through the speaker. And your mother? Daniel laughed softly. Softly, like the answer no longer mattered. Vanessa already found a retirement community outside Hartford. She will adjust. I did not walk into the office after hearing those words. I simply turned quietly and returned to the dining room while the chandelier cast soft golden light across the polished table Arthur and I bought during our 20th wedding anniversary trip to Vermont. Vanessa was placing folded linen napkins beside crystal wine glasses with careful precision, as though preparing for a magazine photo shoot instead of a family dinner held 4 days after a funeral. Daniel will be out in a moment, she said pleasantly without looking up. I thought roast chicken would feel comforting tonight. Comforting. The word almost sounded absurd inside that house now. I sat down slowly at the far end of the table while the housekeeper poured water into my glass. On the surface, everything appeared elegant. Fresh flowers, candlelight, soft music. But grief changes the atmosphere inside a home in ways expensive furniture cannot hide, especially when greed arrives before mourning has even settled. Daniel finally entered the dining room wearing the same navy sweater he used to borrow from Arthur during college winters. For one brief second, seeing him dressed like his father almost made my chest ache. Then he sat across from me and immediately reached for a folder resting beside his plate. Business again. Always business. Mother, he began carefully. There are several documents we should organize before tomorrow. Vanessa lowered her eyes modestly, though I noticed the faint satisfaction hidden beneath her expression. Only to simplify things for everyone, she added softly. I unfolded my napkin carefully onto my lap. How thoughtful. Daniel either missed the meaning in my voice or chose to ignore it. He opened the folder and slid several papers across the table toward me. These are preliminary transfer authorizations, he explained. Nothing major. Just routine estate management. Routine. I glanced down at the documents without touching them. Property transfers. Account access adjustments. Authorization for asset liquidation discussions. My name appeared in highlighted tabs throughout the stack like a formality, standing in the way of something they already considered theirs. You move quickly, I said quietly. Daniel sighed impatiently. Mother, this is exactly what father would have wanted. Efficiency. No. Arthur would have wanted kindness. Decency. Time to grieve before reducing a lifetime into signatures and percentages. But I did not say that aloud. Instead, I lifted my water glass slowly and looked toward the empty chair at the head of the table where Arthur always sat carving turkey on Thanksgiving mornings while snow gathered outside the windows. Nobody had touched that chair since his funeral. Even Vanessa avoided sitting there. Some absences still carried authority. You should really think about the Hartford community, Vanessa said gently while serving vegetables onto her plate. The grounds are beautiful. Private gardens. Wellness programs. Women your age love it there. Women your age. Not Margaret. Not family. Just a category. A problem to relocate. I noticed Daniel watching me carefully now, waiting for resistance. Waiting for emotion. Instead, I picked up the top document and pretended to study the pages longer than necessary. The silence unsettled them more than anger ever could. Finally, I reached for the pen resting beside the folder. Vanessa straightened slightly in her chair. Daniel leaned forward almost imperceptibly. But before the pen touched paper, my eyes stopped on a familiar signature near the bottom of the final page. Arthur Whitmore, dated 3 months earlier. Beneath it sat a handwritten note in Arthur's unmistakable script. Any transfer of estate property requires approval from Margaret Whitmore exclusively. All previous authorizations are void upon my death. I lifted my eyes slowly toward Daniel. For the first time all evening, my son looked nervous. Daniel stared at the handwritten note for several long seconds without speaking. The confidence that had carried him through dinner seemed to crack almost invisibly beneath the warm dining room light. Vanessa reached for the document quickly, scanning the signature herself while maintaining that polished expression she always wore when things stopped going according to plan. This does not change anything substantial, she said lightly, though her voice sounded tighter now. It simply means Margaret needs to approve procedural decisions first. Procedural decisions. Such elegant language for trying to remove me from my own life. I folded the papers neatly and placed them back into the folder before sliding it across the table toward Daniel. Then I suppose nothing will happen until I am ready, I said calmly. No one touched their food after that. The roast chicken cooled untouched beneath the dining room chandelier, while tension settled over the table like heavy winter fog. Daniel poured himself another glass of wine with slightly unsteady hands. I noticed it immediately because Arthur's hands used to shake exactly the same way whenever financial pressure overwhelmed him during difficult years building the company. For the first time since the funeral, I wondered whether my son looked less like a villain and more like a man drowning quietly inside choices he no longer knew how to escape. But then Vanessa spoke again. Margaret, she said gently, surely you understand Daniel is only trying to preserve what Arthur worked for. Preserve. Another carefully selected word. I looked toward the empty chair at the head of the table. Arthur never measured success by property or accounts. He measured it by loyalty, by family dinners, by trust. The irony would have broken his heart. Your husband already preserved what mattered, I replied softly. Vanessa's expression barely shifted, but I saw the flicker in her eyes. She realized I knew more than I was supposed to know. Daniel stood abruptly and loosened his collar. Excuse me for a moment, he muttered before walking toward Arthur's office again. Vanessa waited only 3 seconds before following him down the hallway. I remained seated alone at the table while the grandfather clock near the staircase ticked steadily through the silence. Then I heard their voices, faint at first, then sharper. I told you she found something, Vanessa whispered harshly. You said Evelyn only had the original documents. Daniel lowered his voice too much for me to hear clearly before Vanessa answered again. If she delays the transfer much longer, the bank is going to start asking questions. My eyes lifted slowly from the untouched plate in front of me. Bank. Questions. Suddenly Arthur's warnings about hidden debts and failed investments no longer sounded abstract. The pressure around Daniel was real. Dangerous enough to push him into humiliating his own mother publicly before his father was even buried. I stood quietly and carried my untouched dinner plate into the kitchen. The housekeeper offered to clean up, but I shook my head gently. You should go home early tonight, I told her softly. There is nothing else needed. By the time the kitchen emptied and the downstairs lights dimmed, the house finally felt quiet again. I climbed the staircase slowly toward my bedroom when I noticed faint light still glowing beneath Arthur's office door. Daniel and Vanessa were still inside, arguing softly now. I continued past them without a sound and entered my bedroom before locking the door behind me for the first time in nearly 30 years. Then I crossed toward Arthur's side of the closet and reached into the pocket of his old wool overcoat, hanging untouched beside mine. My fingers found exactly what he once told me would always be there if I ever truly needed protection. A small silver key attached to a tag labeled simply with 2 words written in Arthur's handwriting. Safety deposit. I left the house before sunrise the next morning while the streets of Boston still glistened from overnight rain. Daniel and Vanessa were asleep upstairs, or at least pretending to be. I moved quietly through the front hallway beneath framed family photographs that suddenly felt almost fictional now. Christmas mornings, graduation parties, summers at the lake, smiling faces preserved behind glass while something colder had been growing underneath for years without me fully seeing it. Arthur used to say families rarely collapse all at once. They crack slowly, silently, until one day the damage finally becomes impossible to ignore. The safety deposit key remained hidden inside my coat pocket as I drove downtown through pale gray morning fog. Arthur rented the box at a private bank near Beacon Hill shortly after he sold the company's first major expansion contract nearly 15 years earlier. I remembered because he took me to dinner afterward and ordered expensive champagne, even though we could barely afford luxuries back then. One day, he told me that night, smiling across the candlelight, "If life ever becomes complicated, this account will keep you safe." At the time, I thought he meant financial emergencies. I never imagined he meant our own son. The bank lobby was nearly empty when I arrived. Soft classical music drifted through the marble interior, while an older receptionist greeted me with quiet professionalism. Arthur and I had banked there for decades. Old money respected routine more than warmth. After signing several forms, I was escorted into a private vault room lined with steel boxes and dim yellow lighting. The manager retrieved box 317 without speaking unnecessarily and left me alone at the small wooden table in the center of the room. My hands remained steady this time as I unlocked the box. Grief had changed into something colder now, clearer. Inside sat several sealed envelopes, trust documents, and a thick navy folder labeled simply with my name, Margaret Whitmore. Beneath it rested another video drive. I opened the folder first. Trust agreements, property deeds, investment accounts I had never seen before. Arthur had quietly moved nearly 40% of his personal holdings into an irrevocable trust solely under my authority over the last 2 years. Not Daniel's, not shared family control. Mine alone. Attached to the front page was a handwritten instruction from Arthur. If Daniel attempts coercion, intimidation, or public humiliation toward Margaret Whitmore after my death, his inheritance converts immediately into supervised trust distribution with no direct asset control. I read the sentence twice to make sure I understood it correctly. Arthur did not merely suspect betrayal. He prepared for it in detail. The second envelope contained copies of correspondence between Arthur and Evelyn discussing concerns over Daniel's financial instability. One letter mentioned overdue loans exceeding $2 million connected to failed commercial real estate investments Vanessa encouraged aggressively during the previous year. My chest tightened slightly as pieces finally connected together. The urgency, the pressure, the sudden obsession with transfers and signatures before the funeral flowers had even died. Daniel was not only greedy, he was desperate. Then I inserted the second video drive into the small laptop provided inside the vault room. Arthur appeared on screen again, older and visibly weaker than the previous recording. But his eyes remained calm. "Margaret," he said softly, "if you reach this recording, then our son crossed the line completely." He paused for several seconds before continuing. "I protected Daniel his entire life because I believed failure would destroy him. But protecting a grown man from consequences eventually destroys everyone around him instead." I lowered my eyes slowly as Arthur's voice filled the quiet vault room. "Evelyn does not yet know about the Hartford account," he continued. "And Daniel certainly does not know about the final condition attached to his inheritance." Then Arthur leaned slightly closer toward the camera. "If our son humiliates you publicly a second time during the will proceedings, everything passes directly to you. The second proceeding began at 10 o'clock sharp the following morning. The same conference room. The same polished walnut table. The same careful silence hanging beneath the soft hum of recessed lighting. But this time, I walked into the room differently. Not stronger exactly. Just awake. Daniel stood near the windows speaking quietly with Vanessa when I entered. He stopped immediately the moment he saw me. I noticed the dark circles beneath his eyes and the tension in his jaw. Vanessa remained perfectly composed in a pale gray suit with her blonde hair pinned neatly behind her shoulders, though her fingers tightened slightly around the leather folder she carried. Evelyn Brooks arrived moments later carrying 3 sealed envelopes and a slim black recorder. Without unnecessary greetings, she took her seat at the head of the table and opened Arthur's file. "Before we continue with the final distribution instructions," she said calmly, "there is an additional statement from Arthur Whitmore that must be entered into the record." Daniel exhaled sharply and leaned back in his chair. "More recordings?" he muttered. Evelyn ignored the comment completely. She pressed play. Arthur's voice filled the room immediately. Older, tired, but unmistakably steady. "If this message is being heard," he began, "then my family failed the simplest responsibility I ever asked of them. Protect Margaret." Nobody moved. Outside the windows, cold November sunlight reflected against neighboring office buildings while the city moved on below us, completely unaware that an entire family was quietly collapsing inside that room. Arthur continued speaking. "Wealth reveals character faster than hardship ever does, especially inside families." I saw Vanessa lower her eyes. Daniel crossed his arms tightly without speaking. Then Arthur paused briefly before his voice hardened in a way I had never heard before. "If my son humiliates his mother publicly after my death, he forfeits direct control of every remaining family asset under the Hartford Clause." Daniel sat upright immediately. "What clause?" he snapped, turning toward Evelyn. But Evelyn was already sliding documents across the table. "Arthur established an irrevocable conditional trust 18 months ago," she explained evenly. "Under the terms of the agreement, all executive authority transfers solely to Margaret Whitmore if public misconduct toward her occurs during estate proceedings." Daniel stared down at the papers as the color slowly drained from his face. "That is insane," he whispered. Vanessa grabbed the documents next, scanning them rapidly before finally looking toward me for the first time without that polished mask of superiority. "Fear changes people quickly. This cannot be legal," Daniel said louder now. "My father was manipulated." Evelyn's expression never changed. "Your father anticipated that accusation specifically," she replied before opening the final envelope. Inside sat printed copies of Daniel's private loan defaults, investment liabilities, and correspondence regarding plans to liquidate family property immediately after the funeral. The room fell silent again except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Daniel looked stunned. Vanessa looked trapped. I remained still with my hands folded neatly in my lap, exactly the way Arthur taught me to remain calm during difficult negotiations decades earlier. "You went through my finances?" Daniel asked hoarsely. "No," Evelyn answered quietly. "Your father did." Daniel suddenly pushed back from the table and stood. "This is unbelievable," he said, his voice breaking beneath the pressure finally crushing him from every direction. "You are all acting like she is some innocent victim." Then he looked directly at me with anger sharp enough to cut through every remaining illusion between us. "Do you know what father spent his entire life doing? Cleaning up after her weaknesses." The words landed heavily across the room. Not because they hurt anymore. Because Arthur predicted them perfectly. Evelyn slowly removed her glasses and closed the final folder. "Then the condition has officially been satisfied," she said quietly. "As of this moment, Margaret Whitmore becomes sole controlling beneficiary of the Whitmore estate."